So I'd like to welcome everyone to the Hello Girls. I am Sheila Budoff with Arlington County's 55 Plus program. And I am just delighted that you could join us for this very special program. The program is being recorded and will be posted to the Arlington County 55 Plus YouTube channel for later viewing as time permits. Our speaker will be spotlighted so that she will be the only one who appears in the recording. Okay, so in honor of Women's History Month, March, we're going to pay tribute to the Hello Girls, officially known as the Signal Corps Female Telephone Operators Unit. During World War II, these women worked as switchboard operators and relayed messages from the front lines about troop movements and supplies. So as you can imagine, their service was extremely essential and truly helped us win the war. Our presenter today is Caitlin Cutrona. She is a museum teacher at the National Museum of the U.S. Army. Caitlin received her master's degree in history from the University of South Carolina and has been working as a museum teacher at the National Museum of the U.S. Army for about 2 years, and she's made numerous presentations. We're going to leave some time at the end for questions, but Caitlin has also advised me that during her presentation, she will be asking you questions and would request that you respond using the chat function. Which you'll find at the bottom of your screen. It's close to the middle. And if you have any questions about how to use that, you can unmute yourself and ask me. For the time being, I would ask that everybody please remain on mute so that we can avoid any interruptions from background noise, phone ringing, dogs barking, and the like. So without further ado, I'm going to turn the program over to Caitlin Cutrona.
All right, well, hello everyone. My name is Caitlin and I am a museum teacher at the National Museum of the United States Army. I did want to thank you for joining me today for our virtual field trip, Our Girls Over There, the Hello Girls in World War I. So for today's program, we are going to be learning more about the commitment, sacrifices, and challenges of the over 200 women who served the American Expeditionary Forces as telephone operators, connecting calls between the front lines and higher headquarters. And so just a reminder, as I'm asking questions throughout today's program, feel free to go ahead and put any responses you have in the chat. And then at the end of the presentation, you should have some time to ask any general questions about what we have been talking about today. Now, I am broadcasting from the National Army Museum pictured here. The museum is located in Fort Belvoir, Virginia, and our mission is to tell the history of America's oldest military service, which is the United States Army. And the museum does this by focusing on the stories and artifacts used by individual soldiers from the founding of the nation until the present. Today, we're also going to be hearing from the Army Women's Museum, which is located in Fort Lee, Virginia. The museum pictured here tells the story of female patriots who have served our nation from the American Revolution to the present. The museum's mission is to conserve and preserve a repository of artifacts and archives related to women's service in the U.S. Army. So as we begin our program today, to really understand the story behind female telephone operators serving overseas during World War I, who were often nicknamed the Hello Girls, we first need to understand the new invention that was transforming American life at this time, which was the telephone. So today, with devices like smartphones, we can communicate with others in just a matter of seconds. But there was a time about 100 years ago when telephones didn't even exist. So my first question for you to think about today is, before the invention of the telephone, what are some ways that people communicated with one another? So you can go ahead and feel free to put any responses in the chat. Again, we're thinking about before the telephone even existed, what are some ways that you feel like people communicated with one another? All right, so we have a couple of responses coming in. So a few of you are saying letters, telegrams, Morse code. Again, all great responses to thinking about how did people communicate with one another before the invention of the telephone. We might also think about other ways of communication, like talking face to face, possibly using flags or some other type of signal, maybe even telling someone to pass on a message or potentially leaving something behind. And I noticed that someone mentioned the semaphore flags as a type of signal that might have been used at the time. Now, when we think about these different forms of communication, particularly when comparing them to the telephone, letters, telegrams, potentially leaving messages behind, can you think of any potential problems with these forms of communication? And again, a couple of responses coming in. Someone mentioned that a problem could be time. When we think about these forms of communication, certainly slower than when we think about the telephone. Again, people mentioning delays, generally slower. Maybe potentially even interceptions in these communication methods, not as secure. So again, all great responses when we think about these methods of communication, certainly slower. Someone mentioned party line phones, and so that kind of gets back into that interception or maybe that information being more broadly disseminated. And when we have slower forms of communication, that just leads into other problems like potential for inaccuracies, for outdated information, and just in general having miscommunication. So the invention of the telephone was the answer to these slow and inaccurate communication problems. The telephone allowed people to speak with someone else in real time in another location. And in turn, this revolutionized the way that Americans and the world formed relationships and did business. So now that we're all on the same page, we can clearly see that the telephone was an important invention that transformed the country. We do need to understand a little bit about how telephones worked, because the technology to keep phones running during World War I is essential to understanding why female telephone operators were necessary in the first place. So how does a telephone work? Well, the first telephone was patented by Alexander Graham Bell in 1876, and we can see Bell pictured here. Now, at the time, telephones were connected to one another by a wire in order to communicate with other telephones. So basically, telephones operate by using sound waves. So in a telephone, specifically a landline telephone, voices travel in small sound waves. Those sound waves are carried to a thin metal disc inside of a telephone known as a diaphragm. And then those sound waves are converted into electrical energy. That electrical energy travels over the wires to another phone, where that electrical energy is then converted back into sound waves, which can be heard by users on the other ends. Now, I will say that's about as much science as this history person is ever going to explain to anyone, but hopefully it just gives you a basic understanding of telephone technology at the time. Now, in this example that I was just talking about, we are just connecting two phones with one wire. But as more and more people started using the telephones, more lines were added, and all of those lines would eventually meet at what was called a central exchange or a switchboard. And so we can see an example of one such exchange here on the screen. Now, in just a moment, I am going to play you just a short video that's meant to give you an idea about what this type of telephone exchange might have looked like and how it operated. This video does not have any sound, but I'm just going to walk you through a few of the things that we're seeing happening in this video as it's playing. All right, so what we're seeing here is that these switchboards were manned by operators who could manually connect wires together to route calls. And we can see those operators at work right there. Now, telephone users would pick up the phone, immediately connecting to the switchboard. The operator would respond, "Number, please," and then "Hold the line, please," and would plug a patch cord into that person's number on a switchboard to connect the two calls. So that might sound simple, but for long distance calls or even local calls in a big city, That patchwork of cords and switchboards could be extensive. Many calls required connecting callers through multiple exchanges, and so as a result, you could end up waiting a while before you were finally connected to the person you wanted to speak to. Now, the expansion of the telephone exchanges transformed the workforce and created an entirely new job opportunity for women. Originally, Bell Telephone Company hired young men to work the switchboards, but they lacked the decorum and attention to detail needed to perform the work. One manager actually said that if the company continued with boys as operators, it was virtually facing bankruptcy. So telephone companies shifted tactics. They began hiring women to fill the role in place of young boys. And telephone companies believed that women innately possess the skills necessary to be a good operator. Skills like respectable deportment, accuracy, attention to detail, patience, good hearing, and refined speech. And probably equally as important, their labor was considerably cheaper than hiring men for the same task. Now, by 1900, 80% of all telephone operators in the United States were women. A 1902 report by the US Census Bureau stated, "It has been demonstrated beyond all doubt that the work of operating is better handled by women than by men or boys, and that trained and well-bred women operators perform the most satisfactory service." As telephone operators switched from men to women, a very specific image of what a telephone operator should look like emerged in society. According to Catherine Schmidt, who was Bell's first female supervisor, the operator must be the paragon of perfection, a kind of human machine. Operators were expected to be white, native-born speakers who were young and unmarried. They had to possess a pleasing, well-modulated voice and a patient demeanor. And although the women would never be seen by their clients, height, weight, arm length, and posture were also considered in this application. Now, this expectation of perfection also carried outside of the workplace. Companies hired investigators to inspect applicants' homes to make sure that that genteel image that the applicant was portraying in person carried into their home life. Now, the photograph on your screen here, which was from the New York Telephone and Telegraphy Company, really encapsulates this ideal of perfection. So operators, as we can see here in this image, man the switchboards 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. All operators were expected to complete hundreds of calls per hour during peak times, although the number of calls would vary depending on the operator's location. So just to give you an idea about the quantity of calls telephone operators completed each day, by 1900, there were nearly 600,000 phones in Bell's telephone system. That number shot up to 2.2 million phones by 1905 and 5.8 million by 1910. So as we've seen, the telephone really transformed civilian communication at home and also in the workplace. And so not surprisingly, it also had a huge impact on the Army. Accurate communication has always been important to the military. You might remember the Revolutionary War and Paul Revere. How did he communicate something was happening to others? Well, through lanterns. And so this is a small example of the importance of communication to the military and the ways that soldiers have communicated with one another in the past. And many of these early communication technologies are actually on display in the National Army Museum. So here we have some images of those artifacts. So we can see that the Army used things like flags and signal rockers, and even carrier pigeons. Again, these were all ways that the Army used to communicate with troops on the ground. Now, while the Army didn't invent the telephone, its ability to ensure real-time communication made it invaluable. The telephone allowed officers and soldiers to communicate across hundreds of miles spread out over the battlefield. It could be used to facilitate troop movements, supply orders, and moment-by-moment tactical decisions. Now, as we kind of saw earlier with those previous communication technologies, this type of real-time communication was basically impossible before the telephone. Now, in 1917, after the United States entered World War I, the first units sent to France were telephone battalions. These Bell battalions, as they were known, were made up of soldiers who'd previously worked for Bell telephone companies, and they were sent to France with the mission to set up telephone lines, switchboards, and exchanges. However, once the lines and switchboards were set up in France, the Army ran into the same problem as telephone companies years earlier, and that was a lack of competent switchboard operators. Most soldiers had never seen a switchboard before shipping overseas. While many worked for a telephone company before serving, that gendered aspect of telephone operating that we talked about earlier meant that these men really had no idea how to work a switchboard. Now, in addition to a lack of training, few soldiers spoke French, and this turned out to be a big problem because communication along the Western Front required interaction with French armies and French telephone workers. So not only did the soldiers not know how to work the equipment, but then they couldn't understand the people speaking French on the other end of the lines once they got through. And so these problems led Captain Robert B. Owens to make what was at the time an unheard of recommendation, recruiting bilingual American women to operate the lines. Now, many thought this idea was absurd, but one soldier, Colonel Parker Hitt, who was in charge of General Pershing's communications, he liked this idea. And Pershing was dissatisfied with the way that communications were progressing, and so he looked to Hitt to fix this problem. Hitt drafted an order to Pershing with this suggestion, and Pershing was on board. On November 8, 1917, General Pershing sent a cable from AEF headquarters in Chaumont to Washington, D.C., and in it he asked, on account of the great difficulty of obtaining properly qualified men, request organization and dispatch to France a force of women telephone operators, all speaking French and English equally well. And so with that request, the creation of the Army's first all-female telephone operator unit began. Now, to truly understand what made this request so extraordinary for the time, we just need to take a quick look at the historical role of women in the U.S. Army. Women have served in the U.S. Army from the American Revolution up to World War I. However, much of that service took place in unofficial capacity. So in the American Revolution, some women did serve in combat either alongside their husbands or disguised as men. And likewise, during the Civil War, although women were technically forbidden from joining the military, over 400 women served as secret soldiers. Yet again, during both the Revolutionary War and the American Civil War, most women served in traditional roles as nurses, seamstresses, and cooks for troops in camp. It wasn't until the Spanish-American War in 1898, which coincided with an epidemic of typhoid fever, that the Army realized it needed highly qualified Army nurses. The Army acknowledged nurses' selfless service during the Spanish-American War with the establishment of the Nurse Corps as a permanent part of the medical department in 1901. Nurses were appointed to the regular Army for a 3-year period, although nurses were not actually commissioned as officers in the regular Army during this period of time. So based on this information, we can see that Pershing's request to organize and dispatch to France a force of women telephone operators was remarkable for the time. For the first time, women were being requested in a role other than nurse and for service in a position that would take them on or near the front lines. Now, Pershing's request was first received by First Lieutenant Ernest Wesson, who was new to Washington, and he asked no questions and immediately went to work fulfilling that request. He contacted Bell Telephone to arrange for training, the French Embassy for language proficiency testing, and he even contacted the Associated Press to start recruitment. Now, for any of you who may be familiar with Army policy and the chains of command, you might be shaking your head at the manner in which this request was filled, basically quickly and without approval from a supervisor. And it wasn't long before Wesson found himself called to the White House to explain his actions. But regardless, Wesson had already put into motion a mechanism for recruiting, training, and equipping telephone operators that mirrored practices that were used to recruit male soldiers for the Signal Corps. So the Army began recruiting telephone operators, and the most important thing was spreading the word, making sure that women were aware of this opportunity. And they did that through ads and recruiting posters in newspapers and magazines. So we're going to go ahead and take a closer look at some of those recruiting ads. I'm just going to read the first one right now. And as I'm reading through this ad, I'd like you to think about in the back of your mind kind of what stands out to you about this advertisement. So it says, U.S. wants Hello Girls needed on French front. A unit of 150 telephone operators able to speak both French and English for immediate service in France will be formed under the direction of the Army Signal Corps. The operators enlisted for the duration of the war will be given allowances of quarters and rations accorded to Army nurses, in addition to their pay, and also will wear the same uniform. In seeking recruits for the new service, the announcement of the Chief Signal Officer says, young ladies physically fit with command of the French and English language, desirous of obtaining these positions should apply. So based on what you just heard with this advertisement, and I'll go ahead and leave it up on the screen, what stands out to you about this ad? Specifically thinking about what are some requirements for this position that you've been able to identify, and what are some of the benefits? So someone noticed the kind of duration of this position, specifically it's saying that they're going to be enlisted for the duration, so the entirety of the war. They said a benefit could potentially be the income, so getting those allowances and quarters and rations similar to Army nurses. Someone else pointed out in terms of a requirement that this ad doesn't actually specifically mention the ability to operate switchboards. We can see that the ad does specifically ask for these women to have a command of the French and English language. So very interesting observation there. Someone else noted that a potential benefit is the fact that according to this ad, they are enlisting. They're enlisting for the duration. You may have also noticed that the ad refers to them as recruits. So as we continue to kind of think about what we're noticing in this ad, when we think about the requirements, we talked about the fact that the ad says they need to have a command of the French and English language, and that they need to wear a uniform. We'll talk more about the uniform a little bit later in the program, and we can see that there was an application process. In fact, it was quite a rigorous application process. Now, when we're thinking about the benefits, we can see again that they were to be given allowances for quarters and rations similar to Army nurses. And kind of before we move on from this advertisement, I do want us to think about some of the phrasing, some of the terminology that's being used in this ad. And a few of you have actually already pointed out some of that, specifically the fact that this advertisement is saying that the operators are going to be enlisting and that they were called recruits. So based on what we've just talked about, as someone reading this ad, what assumptions would you make about the telephone operator's status in the US Army? Specifically, kind of based on what we talked about, would you think that these telephone operators were enlisted in the Army or that they were just going to be civilian employees? What do you think? Feel free to go ahead and share your thoughts in the chat. So it looks like as our responses coming in, we have a few differences in opinion, but many of you are saying that you feel like they would be enlisted. So essentially an official part of the military. And so this question, what was the operator status, is something that I want you to continue to think about as we're gonna go ahead and turn to another example of an advertisement, this time from the South Bend News Times. So just like before, I'm going to read through this ad and I want you to be thinking about what's standing out to you. Now, this ad says, want women telephone operators in the US Army. A call for young women as telegraph and telephone operators in the Signal Corps has been sent out by the War Department. Applicants are required to speak English and French fluently, and they will be classed as civilian employees. So once again, we'll just take a little bit of time. Feel free to put in the chat what you notice about this ad, specifically thinking about, is there anything different or similar between this advertisement that I just read and the one that we had looked at previously? Any kind of observations about this ad, particularly as it compares to the ad that we looked at previously? Now, someone has noted right away a major difference between these two advertisements is kind of the status of these women telephone operators and how that status is described. This ad specifically says that they would be classed as civilian employees versus the previous ad kind of had that terminology about enlisted for the duration, recruits, and that lends lent us to believe that they would be enlisted in the Army. Someone did ask, would there be a reluctance to send young women as enlisted personnel so the civilian aspect is emphasized? And that's definitely going to be something that will factor into the kind of final outcome of the status for these women telephone operators, which we'll talk a little bit more about in the program. All right, any other similarities or differences that people would like to go ahead and point out here for this advertisement? So just a couple of similarities that I'd like to point out as well is the fact that we do see that English and French fluency with this advertisement, and also the fact that there is going to be an application process that was emphasized in both. Someone pointed out that this one specifically mentions young women as telegraph and telephone operators, so having both of those communication methods there as well. All right, so based on what we have talked about with these two advertisements, what conclusions can you draw between these two ads, particularly when we think about the status of these female telephone operators? Anything that kind of clearly stands out to you between these two ads? And one thing to kind of think about is, after we've read through both of these ads, would you be able to answer the question of, are these women going to be enlisted in the Army, or are they going to serve as civilian employees? Kind of that question that we looked at a little bit earlier. Now, I will say that personally, having read through these advertisements, it doesn't seem necessarily always as clear about what the status of these operators are going to be. We can see in this ad here specifically that they clearly say that they're going to be civilian employees, but when we compare that to the previous ad that doesn't mention civilians at all, it is a little unclear. And so through these ads, we can kind of see that there's going to be confusion about whether these women are going to be civilian contractors or whether they're going to be enlisted soldiers. And this is actually confusion that's going to surround the Army for decades to come. And it's certainly going to have an impact on the women who served long after World War I. And again, that's something that we'll continue to talk about as we go through our program. Now, like any job or enlistment in the military, there was an application process. That was something that was very clear in both advertisements. For the Hello Girls, the two main requirements were a fluency in French and or the ability to work a switchboard. And I do use that term and or because, as historian Jill Freeman will point out, over time, those technical skills of being able to operate a switchboard are going to be deemed easy enough to learn on the job versus language acquisition skills, which take years. And so actually only 42% of those inducted had prior telephone experience, whereas 78% spoke French. And so we can really see the emphasis on that bilingual skill in that statistic there. Now, once the women were selected, they received appointment paperwork like this offer letter here that was issued to operator Louise Ruth. So we're going to go ahead and take a closer look at the paperwork. And once again, I'm going to read through sections of this appointment letter, and I want you to be thinking about what is standing out to you here. So it says, Louise Ruth was this date appointed operator telephone unit in the Signal Service at large at $60 per month, with allowance of rations, quarters, and medical attendance accorded Army nurses. Now, it goes on to say that she will be directed to report to you for assignments upon completion of primary course in School of Instruction for telephone operators. It also says that she executed the oath of office on February 20th, 1918, and that she entered upon duty on February 20th, 1918. Now, after reading through this letter, taking a couple minutes to think about this, does anything stand out to you about the information provided in this appointment paperwork? And again, I'll keep this appointment letter up on the screen so that you can reference back to it. Anything stand out to you? All right, so someone noted that they don't see any particular rank in this appointment paperwork. Although someone else noted that it does say how much she will be paid, $60 per month. Someone else noted the oath of office, executed the oath of office. That seems, again, more like phrasing you might expect to see for a male soldier enlisting in the Army at this time. And someone else noted that the terminology in this appointment paperwork is a little bit confusing, just like what we saw with the advertisements, because we do see some civilian terms throughout the letter, but also the fact that it's talking about that they're going to be issued rations and quarters, just like Army nurses, and also using, again, the phrase executed her oath of office, and she's entering upon her duty. So some great observations there. I really appreciate the responses. So when we think about what does this tell us about the Hello Girls, we can see from this appointment paperwork that many were issued an oath of office, which again is something that was consistent with enlisted soldiers. So this type of language and the Army's actions communicated a message to these women that they were soldiers. Now, like soldiers, the Hello Girls undertook training before traveling to France. Their training included military drill. So they were taught about the Army, its traditions and military terms. They learned things like how to salute, how to address other soldiers. They learned how to wear Army equipment. So basically, in every way, they appeared to be and were treated as if they were soldiers. Now, since many had limited telephone experience, as we kind of talked about earlier, AT&T put each through a course of intensive instruction in PBX systems and battery exchanges to learn local and long distance techniques. Now, as written in the telephone review, every soldier must have a uniform, and the telephone operator units, being part of the Army organization, are no exception to the rule. So we can see this uniform pictured here. We're actually going to learn a little bit more about their uniforms, and to do that, I'm going to play this video in which my colleague Jen is going to talk more about the telephone operator's uniform and its significance. This will have sound, so please feel free to let me know if you are not hearing any sound as the video is playing on your end.
Hi, my name is Jen, and I'm an educator at the National Army Museum. Today I'm going to tell you more about the uniform and equipment that was used by the Female Telephone Operators Unit, or more commonly known as the Hello Girls, during World War I. Soldiers are issued uniforms to identify themselves as members of the Army, and their uniform is designed to help them perform a specific role. Like soldiers, the Hello Girls had a uniform. But unlike soldiers who were issued uniforms, the Hello Girls were given a list of items to purchase themselves. These items cost anywhere between $50 and $250. The uniform I'm wearing today is representative of the Hello Girls winter uniform, which means it was made of a heavier material to withstand the cold. The uniform consists of this navy wool jacket with gold buttons and a navy skirt that was made of the same material. The Hello Girls were required to wear these uniforms at all times, including when they took leave. Soldiers also wear patches on their uniforms that identify their rank and level of experience in the Army. The Hello Girls were no different. They were also issued patches that were worn on the sleeves of their coat. The insignia identified them by their skill and experience, even if not a formal rank like men. This insignia indicated that the woman was either an operator, a supervising operator, or a chief operator. An outline of a telephone transmitter embroidered on a white armband indicated operator. A laurel wreath below the transmitter meant supervisor, and a lightning bolt above the transmitter indicated chief operator. Their garrison cap also had a small metal emblem of cross semaphore flags on the cap. This was, and still is, the insignia of the Signal Corps, and identified the Hello Girls membership in the unit. In addition to a uniform, soldiers are issued specific equipment to carry out their job. The number and type of equipment items are determined by the soldier's mission. So like soldiers, the Hello Girls were issued equipment items based on their mission and proximity to the front lines. Because they were within range of enemy artillery fire and were considered targets by German airplane attacks, the Hello Girls were issued the same helmets and gas masks of the American Expeditionary Forces. While operating the switchboards, the Hello Girls were required to keep these items close by to where they were seated, like this Brody helmet that was issued to all soldiers to protect their heads from projectiles and shrapnel. If you look closely at this helmet, you can see that it is made of metal, which makes it pretty heavy, and it has a chin strap to secure it to their head. They also had these gas masks. These masks were kept in a canvas bag and was meant to protect them from toxic gases. The women received training on how to use these masks, but thankfully never needed to use them in a real situation. I hope this gives you a better idea.
All right, so as we saw in this video, Army uniforms and brass insignia conferred status. Only enlisted personnel and officers were legally entitled to wear uniforms. And so by issuing uniforms to these women telephone operators, that sent a very specific message that again equated them with soldiers. Now, once the operators completed their training and medical examinations and received their uniforms, they headed overseas. The first unit of operators left New York Harbor aboard the military transport ship, the Celtic. We can see the passenger list from the ship actually here on the screen. Now, the first unit to ship out was led by Chief Operator Grace Banker, who wrote in her journal at the time of her journey, "After 2 months of preparation in the USA, I've crossed the Rubicon now. There can be no turning back." Now, I'm going to go ahead and zoom into a portion of this passenger list. I'd just like to draw your attention to this name right here, Miss Cordelia Dupuy. Just want you to keep her name in the back of your mind because we'll talk a little bit more about her later on in the program. Now, like other soldiers newly arrived overseas, the Signal Corps women faced some core initial tasks. They had to master their assignments, develop good relationships with their coworkers, and basically just settle into military life. The orientation memo all of the women received upon arrival read, "The results of battles and lives of thousands of our soldiers frequently depend upon the speed and accuracy with which telephone operators complete connections. In other words, speed saved lives." And the women did quickly get to work. The average time to connect a phone call from the frontline trench to the Command Operations Center was about 50 seconds before the arrival of the Hello Girls. That subsequently dropped to an average of 10 seconds after the women's arrival. And the operators were critical to the American Expeditionary Force's major offensive because all offensive and defensive maneuvers needed to be coordinated through these operators. For example, if the enemy was launching an assault into Allied trenches, an Allied response required a telephone operator to be able to connect the call for artillery or for reinforcements. Now, telephone lines were typically busiest right before a drive during a campaign as troops struggled to get into position and supply units rushed to equip them. During some of the largest Army campaigns, the operators worked around the clock in 12-hour shifts to keep the lines moving. As Grace Banker wrote in her diary, "I don't believe anyone not here can realize what busy means." Now, in a show of dedication to duty, the women of the Female Telephone Operators Unit, 1st Army Headquarters, so the group closest to the front lines, had to be forcefully evacuated from their stations during the Meuse-Argonne campaign when their building caught fire. Once the fire was out, they quickly returned to their posts, and within an hour, telephone operations were restored. Now, to really understand the experiences of the Hello Girls, I'd like to go ahead and take a look at 2 individual operators specifically. And that first operator pictured here is Cordelia Dupuy, whose name I mentioned earlier on the passenger list of the Celtic. Now, prior to joining the Signal Corps, Dupuy worked as a telephone operator in North Dakota when she heard an announcement that the AAF was looking for operators. And so Dupuy was fluent in French, as her parents were French-speaking Canadians, so she made the decision to apply. Her interviewer and her applicant file noted that she was 21, but showed a keen desire to service, and she appeared self-reliant beyond her years and seemed perfectly willing to meet any conditions that the service may bring about. Cordelia's uniform is actually on display at the National Army Museum. You can see that pictured here. So I'd just like you to take a look at the uniform on your screen for a moment and just go ahead and put in the chat anything that you notice that stands out to you about this uniform. And I noticed that someone had asked the question, what was the arm patch for on their uniforms? And so that was actually meant to designate their relative ranks of operator, supervising operator, and chief operator. So feel free to go ahead and take a little bit of time to put in the chat anything that you notice or stands out to you about this uniform. All right, so someone noticed the 3 stripes or chevrons down here on kind of the left sleeve of the uniform. So that actually denotes her time of service. So 3 chevrons there. Now, so you may have noticed if you're comparing this uniform to the uniform that we saw previously in the video with my colleague Jen, that this uniform appears to be a slightly different or lighter color. And that really just simply comes down to the fact that the color has faded over time. And just to give you a little bit more background about Cordelia's service, she served as an operator in France until being relieved of service on January 20th, 1920, and she was discharged with those 3 AAF stripes that I talked about earlier. So each chevron here on this lower left-hand sleeves denotes 6 months of service. Now, some of you may have also noticed some of the different insignia and patches on this uniform. So here on the cap, we can see the insignia for the Signal Corps, and on the uniform specifically, we can see the World War I victory ribbon, as well as the 3rd U.S. Army patch. Now, I want to go ahead and share a story about an additional telephone operator, Louise Ruth. And to do that, I'd like to introduce you to one of my other colleagues, Tracy Bradford, who is from the Army Women's Museum. So she's just going to share with you Ruth's story and show you some artifacts related to Ruth. So once again, you should be able to hear sound in this video. So please let me know if you do not hear the video as it's being played.
Hello from the United States Army Women's Museum at Fort Lee, Virginia. I'm Tracy Bradford, the curator, and it's an honor to share with you the story of a reunion long overdue. For 2 pieces of history separated by time and geography that are together once again. For many years, the Army Women's Museum has been home to the archival collection of Marie Louise Ruth, a telephone operator during World War I. Consisting of more than 100 documents, her archives have been enjoyed by researchers and volunteers alike. The robust collection, containing numerous documents from her impressive life, was used to anchor our Hello Girl exhibit in the Origins of Service Gallery. And now, much to our delight, we are also home to her uniform. For many reasons, pieces and parts of collections can be donated to separate museums. In this case, Ruth's written record came to the Army Women's Museum, and the artifacts, or her uniform items, were sent to the Signal Corps Museum at Fort Gordon, Georgia. So we were thrilled when given the opportunity to obtain the uniform, which is in very good condition, looking much like it did when Louise wore it over a century ago. Now these items are all housed in one facility and will soon be on display together. Louise was born in France in January of 1892 and later immigrated to the U.S., arriving through Ellis Island with her sister Pauline. She received her certificate of arrival on August 17, 1912, and then settled in California with her uncle. When World War I began and General Pershing's American Expeditionary Forces, or AEF, requested volunteers to serve as telephone operators in France, Louise answered the call. In February 1918, she received a letter from the chief signal officer that appointed her as an operator in the telephone unit. She was to be paid $60 a month. Later that spring, Louise received a physical exam and a series of vaccinations in preparation for her eventual deployment. She and colleagues from the Pacific Telephone and Telegraph Company were assigned to the 4th Unit of Signal Corps telephone operators. In June 1918, Louise received orders to report to New York City. In New York, she was issued a certificate of identity. And although she was a civilian employee of the Army, the firm stated that she was entitled, under the laws of war, if captured, to the privileges of a prisoner of war. Louise and her friends managed to do a little sightseeing as well, and were looking sharp in their new uniforms when they visited Coney Island. She set sail in July aboard the Lapland and while en route had fellow passengers sign a souvenir postcard. Many were medical personnel headed to Base Hospital number 25. Once in France, Louise was issued a worker's permit and then served in the AEF headquarters. She kept many items of memorabilia, including photographs, travel receipts, postcards, and Signal Corps documents that paint a full picture of her experiences during the war. At the end of her assignment, a little over a year later, Louise returned aboard the Agamemnon. She settled in California and lived a full life. Louise became a citizen of the United States in 1928. She was active in the effort to have the Hello Girls of World War I receive veteran status, which was finally achieved in 1977. But Louise died 2 years before this dream was realized. I hope you enjoyed this Hello Girl Spotlight from the United States Army Women's Museum. For more information, visit us online at awm.lee.army.mil or stop by in person the next time you come to Central Virginia.
All right, so again, we had a chance to look a little bit more at some of the individual operators, but we're going to finish our program today by talking about the Hello Girls legacy in general. So the Hello Girls continued their service in all of the Army's campaigns in France. And actually at the end of the war, when many soldiers were being mustered out of service, a team of telephone operators were sent to Cologne, Germany to run telephones for the U.S. Army of Occupation. Now, while overseas, Army personnel spoke fondly of the work performed by the female telephone operators. As Colonel Parker Hitt commended the women, a large part of the success of the communications of this Army is due to a competent staff of women operators. And it wasn't just praise that was given to these women. They also received citations and awards for their service. So senior officers selected 30 of the 223 Signal Corps operators for special commendations, and most of those commendations were assigned by General Pershing. Grace Banker, who's pictured here, received the highest honor of all. On May 10th, 1919, she was awarded the Distinguished Service Medal, which was an award created by Woodrow Wilson for bravery in combat. And we can see that medal right here. Now, the citation praised the chief operator's service from Tremont to the Meuse-Argonne and read, by untiring devotion to her exacting duties under trying conditions. However, when these women returned home, despite all of the praise, all of the awards that they had earned, their service was not recognized by the Army or the War Department. The telephone operators were informed that rather than soldiers, the War Department considered them to be civilian contractors. So that gets back to our discussion earlier about this confusion over the status of these women telephone operators. Although the women had signed oaths rather than civilian contracts, received uniforms and insignia, were paid wages equivalent to soldiers, underwent training, and received citations and awards usually given to soldiers, they were not officially considered soldiers. And so as a result, they weren't eligible for any veterans benefits. Still, despite this lack of official recognition, the Hello Girls helped spur change in American society. Their service actually helped turn public sentiment and President Woodrow Wilson toward giving women the right to vote. President Wilson told an audience after World War I, "We have made partners of women in this war. Shall we admit them only to a partnership of suffering and sacrifice and not to a partnership of privilege?" And the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920 finally gave women the right to vote, and its passage came from momentum sparked by women's wartime service, just like the Hello Girl service during World War I. Now, the operators, led by Muriel Egan Anderson, also fought for decades to right this injustice of their lack of official recognition. They were actually kicked out of the American Legion since they weren't considered veterans. So instead, they formed the Women's Overseas Service League. They also started a magazine and named it the Carry On to raise awareness for their cause. It wasn't until 1977 when Congress finally passed a bill to give former Hello Girls veterans benefits. Mark Hugh, who was a lawyer representing the Hello Girls, told the Senate Committee for Veterans Affairs, "There is no question from a legal standpoint that the Army, by treating the Signal Corps women as if they were members of the military, actually made them members of the military." Now, it took over 50 years and more than 24 bills introduced into Congress for these women to be given the recognition that they earned. And even after the bill was signed by President Carter, it took a few more years for the Army to actually process the women's discharge paperwork. The surviving women finally received their official Army discharges in 1979. By that time, only 18 of the original 223 Hello Girls were still living. Now, upon receiving that official recognition, Meryl Egan Anderson said, "The Army has finally admitted we are legitimate. If I do get a victory medal, it should be fighting the Army all these years." Now, as our program is coming to a close today, I do want to thank you once again for attending this virtual field trip. And I do hope that you were able to learn a little bit more about the commitment, challenges, and sacrifices of the Hello Girls during World War I through this program. And now, as promised at the beginning of the program, I do believe that we have some time to be able to take any general questions about what I have talked about today. If you had asked a question earlier in the program that I hadn't gotten a chance to respond to, feel free to go ahead and re-put that in the chat as well. I want to make sure that I'm not missing any questions that you might have, and I'll do my best to be able to answer them. All right, so it does look like someone was asking, is there a list for women who served as telephone operators at the museum or online? I do not believe that there is a list specifically at the museum. I have not searched online to see if such a list exists, but I would guess that, that it probably does through various organizations out there. Again, I don't have a specific resource for you. I apologize, but I wouldn't be too surprised if there was a list of at least a decent amount of the women who served as female telephone operators available through other organizations. So how did other countries handle telephone operators? That's a great question. So I know within France, French women served as telephone operators as well. Now it's kind of interesting based on some of the research that I have done. The American women who served overseas as telephone operators didn't always see eye to eye, at least professionally, with some of their French colleagues. Apparently, there was just some differences in terms of telephone culture that sometimes could lead to some frustrations. The British Army also employed women telephone operaters as well. So a great question about how other countries handled it. So we're near the Hello Girls on the actual front lines. And I'm not sure how close to the action they were. There were definitely Hello Girls that were pretty close to the front line. So when I talked about the women who were stationed at the 1st Army headquarters, my understanding is that they were within kind of 15 miles or so of the front line, so pretty close in that location. Now, originally there were about 6 women who were serving at that particular headquarters, many other telephone operators who were kind of scattered at other command centers throughout France. So some were certainly much closer to the action than others, but even kind of early on, as the US was first sending telephone operators over and as they were first getting involved in the war, even some of the women who were stationed in Paris came under fire from German, long-range shells. And so definitely feeling the impact of the fighting in that way. So someone asked, where is the museum located? So we are located in Fort Belvoir, Virginia, so kind of in that Northern Virginia area, basically a part of or what was Fort Belvoir base land, so very close to the Fort Belvoir base. Someone asked, where did the term Hello Girls originate? So that's another great question. I'm not sure specifically where it originated, what was the original source, but I do know, because sometimes when we think today, we might hear the term Hello Girls and say, that sounds a little bit belittling to call these women girls, but in 1918, it definitely resonated differently. At the time, soldiers were often called boys or doughboys, or in the case of the Signal Corps boys. And so when officers used the terms boys or girls, they were really kind of communicating that fellowship and team effort. And so that was, something that we might view as a difference in terms of the nickname today, but it was not meant to be belittling at the time, but again, was meant to communicate kind of that fellowship. They were also known as Signal Corps girls as well, kind of like the equivalent to the Signal Corps boys. I'm just trying to scroll through. to make sure that I'm not missing anything. So someone had asked specifically about the uniform and whether or not they had the uniform made or it was issued. So my understanding is actually that the uniforms, they essentially had to go out and buy the uniforms for themselves. And as I think we had heard from Jen, they could be pricey overall in what the women had to buy. I've heard estimates of anywhere kind of around the $250 to even $350 range for the time. And because of these women's relative rank, their uniforms had to be individually tailored. So they didn't just get kind of general issue uniforms. They had to go out and have these uniforms made and individually fit to each individual women. Which is why some of the women who did not actually have a chance to serve overseas because they were in the midst of training when the war ended, they were essentially kind of stuck now with the Signal Corps uniform that they had just paid a decent amount of money for, but weren't actually able to use in service overseas. And I'm happy, again, if I missed any questions from earlier, please let me know. I'm happy to take any more questions that you may have as well. So someone asked, did they each have more than one uniform? That's a great question. That's something that would need to do a little bit more research into see specifically what uniform pieces they had. I know in addition to the uniform, they had to buy other things like gloves and some other accompaniments with that. I'm not sure that each woman specifically had more than one uniform. That is a good question though. So what do the armbands mean? So the armbands refer to the ranks for the women. So they were given essentially relative ranks. And if I remember correctly, those ranks were operator, supervising operator, and chief operator. And so each of those armbands had essentially different symbols and insignia that designated what rank the women would have had. And they were considered relative ranks within the Army. I'm happy to take any other questions you have, but I'm also cognizant of time. I don't want to take up more than your time than necessary. How did other branches of the military manage communications? Did they have Hello Girls too? That's another great question. Because our talk is focused specifically on the Army, that's really where my knowledge is on the Hello Girls within the Army. Now, I can tell you that other branches of the military, like the Marines and the Navy, actually actively enlisted women in their branches. So for the Navy, they were considered, Human F classification for females. Now, these women did not serve overseas like what we saw with the Hello Girls. Instead, they were stationed stateside to relieve men, essentially, of kind of the clerical duties that they were then able to go and have active service. All right, so can civilians enter Fort Belvoir? So I will say if you are interested in coming to the museum, because you actually do not need to go into the fort to visit our museum. It is open to the public. There is no gate restriction access or anything like that. Civilians are certainly welcome to enter Fort Belvoir, but you do need to go to the visitor center and be able to get a pass and different requirements there that are not required for the museum, as it is open to the public and not specifically on Fort Belvoir space.
This was absolutely fascinating, Caitlin. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
This was wonderful. And I would add, the 55 Plus program has actually had a trip to the U.S. Army Museum, and people, it's rave reviews. Everybody loved it, loved it, loved it.
All right, well, I do want to say thank you once again for being such a great audience. I really appreciate all of the responses. And I hope, again, you were just able to learn a little bit more about the Hello Girl service during World War I, and maybe we'll have a chance to see your group at the museum again.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Caitlin. This was really wonderful. We appreciate you taking the time and enriching our lives with this wonderful program. Thank you all for joining us. We appreciate it. Look forward to seeing you soon. Take care, everybody. Be well.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Have a good day.